The message had been sent 10 years ago, drifting through the stars like a quiet ripple on a still ocean, simple in its wording but heavy in its warning: do not interfere with humanity. Leave Earth alone. It came from a small blue planet that most of the galaxy barely noticed, sent not with threats or pride, but with calm certainty. The Galactic Senate read it, archived it, and then forgot it, except for one empire. The Varn Dominion, a proud and ancient force in the stars, laughed at the idea that a young species could command such authority. The humans had only just learned to travel beyond their own moon, yet they dared to send a warning to powers that had ruled for centuries. To the Varn, this was not just arrogance, it was an open invitation. So, without hesitation, they came. Not in full force, but with stealth, slipping into Earth's orbit, cloaked and quiet, watching, listening, testing. When no response came, they sent the first strike. Cities on Earth lost power without cause. Satellites blinked out. Entire outposts on Mars and Luna vanished into silence. The humans, it seemed, had nothing to say. The Varn believed they had succeeded, and after a short, cold campaign, they left just as silently, taking with them samples, data, and prisoners. No shots had been fired in open space, no grand battles won, and to the Varn, the humans were just one more species to add to their record: strange, emotional, unrefined, but easily managed. What the Varn didn't know was that the silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Earth had fallen quiet, not in defeat, but in preparation. Deep below the surface, under mountains and oceans, in facilities hidden from even the most advanced scanners, humanity had not only seen the invasion coming, they had planned for it. For decades, Earth had remained neutral in galactic affairs, not out of fear, but out of patience. While other species expanded their empires, humans watched. While others fought wars, humans studied. And while others underestimated, humans remembered. The Varn had ignored the message. Now, humanity remembered every name, every colony, every strike. They had watched the patterns of the Varn, tracked their movements, studied their weaknesses, and they were ready. Not for war, but for something more terrifying: a hunt. When the human vessel Silent Light entered Varn space, no one noticed at first. It moved without sound, using drives no other species recognized, and hull material that absorbed scans like a shadow in the dark. On board, Commander Alia Stroud stood alone at the observation deck, watching the stars drift past her. She had grown up hearing stories of Earth's enemies, but never thought she would be chosen to lead the first mission beyond their borders. She was not just a soldier. She was a symbol of everything humanity had become: calm, precise, and deeply dangerous when provoked. She carried no army, no fleet, and no demands. What she brought was knowledge of every system the Varn had touched, every law they had broken, and every silent scream they had caused. Her mission was simple: find them and make them remember the warning. The first target was not a battlefield. It was a mining station on Hexstar 4, a cold, distant rock that fed Varn's supply chains. The facility ran without guards, confident no one would dare attack so far into Dominion territory. But one morning, the alarms failed to sound. The lights dimmed, gravity flickered, and every worker found themselves floating helplessly as systems collapsed around them. Doors locked. Oxygen levels dropped just low enough to cause panic, but not death. Screens flickered with static, then cleared to show a single human face, Alia's, calm, sharp-eyed, and unblinking. "You were warned," she said. "No threats. No demands. Just the truth." Within hours, the station was offline. Its leaders were unconscious, its data cores stripped, and its supply ships redirected to unknown coordinates. Not a single life was taken, but the message was clear. This was not a raid. This was the beginning. Back on Varn Prime, the High Command held an emergency meeting. Some panicked, others mocked, but none truly understood. One ship? They scoffed. A human? They still believed this was an act of desperation, not precision. They did not see the bigger shape forming in the darkness. But out there, across the stars, other human ships began to move, each different, each cloaked in silence, and each carrying officers trained not for war, but for disruption. Earth had no intention of conquering. They had a list, and the Varn were at the top. As Alia's ship drifted into deep space once more. She stood alone in the dark, listening to old Earth music humming softly through her headset. The sound reminded her of rain, of home, of a time before silence became necessary. She did not smile, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. Behind her, her team worked wordlessly, each one focused, disciplined, and invisible to the stars. They didn't need medals. They didn't want recognition. They were not heroes. They were the answer to a question the galaxy had never asked: what happens when humanity is done waiting? As word of the attack spread, unease rippled through the stars. Outposts doubled their scans. Borders were reinforced, but nothing came. No fleets, no declarations, no armies. Just silence. And in that silence, the galaxy began to remember something they had forgotten. Humanity doesn't roar when it's angry. It waits. It plans. And then, when the time is right, it moves not like a storm, but like a shadow that had always been there. And still, across every Varn-controlled world, one line began to appear, written on walls, hacked into broadcasts, even whispered in the ears of command: you were warned. The Varn Dominion still refused to believe what was happening. They saw the event on Hextar 4 as a one-time incident, perhaps a glitch or sabotage by an internal rebel. They dismissed the human threat, believing Earth lacked the strength to challenge their reach. In truth, they didn't know what they were dealing with. Humanity had changed, evolved quietly while the galaxy watched elsewhere. What they thought was a primitive world had become something entirely different. Back on her ship, Silent Light, Commander Alia Stroud studied the data stolen from the mining facility. There were coordinates to other Varn outposts, supply chains, patrol routes, and detailed layouts of energy grids. Everything the Varn had stolen from others was now being used against them. Alia didn't smile, but she nodded once. The next strike was ready. Her target, Relay Station VX-9, a communication hub that connected nearly 50 Varn colonies. Cutting it off wouldn't just cause panic, it would sever their unity. Her ship approached slowly, silent as always, cloaked in darkness. The Varn stationed there believed themselves safe. After all, who would attack a communication tower without an army? But humans didn't need numbers. They needed only opportunity. The approach began with a drop in the outer perimeter's signal strength. Nothing alarming, just a flicker. Varn technicians blamed a minor solar flare and continued their duties. Moments later, the cooling systems on the main transmission core shut down, causing a slight overheating. Again, they assumed it was routine and sent repair drones. But by the time those drones returned, the internal oxygen sensors had all been recalibrated, and the air started getting thinner. A mild discomfort spread through the station, with officers rubbing their eyes and growing irritable, unaware that subtle changes were being made to their entire environment. Then the lights dimmed to half their normal strength. Emergency systems flicked on automatically, but failed to stabilize. The crew tried to reroute power manually, but the control panels refused to accept their commands. As the panic began to rise, the main screen in the command deck came to life, showing a single symbol: Earth's flag. And beneath it, the same words echoed through every speaker, soft and steady: you were warned. No explosion followed. No battle. Just silence. One by one, each crew member collapsed, not in pain, but as if sleep had suddenly claimed them. Their bodies were later found carefully laid down near walls or beside consoles, breathing and unhurt. Alia and her team had already come and gone, stealing the station's core memory, disabling long-range communication, and installing deep system blocks that would take years to remove. She left behind only one message, a digital tag hidden within the systems: humanity does not forget. By the time reinforcements arrived, VX-9 was cold and useless. No life was lost, yet the damage was deeper than any weapon could cause. Trust in the Dominion's control began to falter. Other outposts wondered how a single ship could do this. Whispers of fear moved faster than their fastest ships. Back in Varn High Command, the debate grew loud. Some still denied it, calling it coincidence or sabotage by internal enemies. Others grew tense, remembering the old message from Earth. One senior strategist, General Karthus, who had once mocked humanity as emotional insects, now paced nervously. He had seen the human attack patterns. They didn't aim for destruction, they aimed for disruption. And that was worse. These strikes were precise, calculated, and utterly unpredictable. They did not come to fight. They came to break the Varn piece by piece, without warships or invasions. Alia's name started to appear in classified files, but no one knew her face or her past. She was only known by her codename, Ghost. And Ghost had struck twice without leaving any trace behind. On board Silent Light, Alia sat at her desk, reviewing surveillance from Varn response teams. Her crew worked quietly around her, each one trained not just in combat, but in engineering, intelligence gathering, and diplomacy. They weren't soldiers in the usual sense. They were problem solvers, and the problem was the Varn Dominion. As she looked through the intercepted messages between Varn officers, Alia saw what she hoped for. Fear was taking root. The Varn were turning their eyes inward, doubting each other, splitting their forces, spreading themselves too thin. And that was exactly what she wanted. Each split, each doubt, made it easier for her next move. Humanity had studied empires for centuries, learning how they rose and fell. The one pattern that always led to collapse wasn't a stronger enemy, it was fear from within. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of the galaxy, others were beginning to notice. Smaller civilizations that had once been crushed by the Varn started paying attention to the broadcasts. A few even tried sending secret messages to Earth pleas for help, or offers of alliance. They didn't know if anyone would hear them. They didn't even know if humanity would care. But they tried. And somewhere in the stars, those messages were picked up. Alia read them one by one, her expression unreadable. Her mission wasn't just about Earth anymore. It was becoming something bigger. She saw how the Varn had silenced voices across systems, taken from weaker species, and written history to erase those crimes. She couldn't fight every battle, but she could open every locked door. That was what the first strike had truly meant. Not revenge, not justice, exposure. And now, as the Silent Light moved on toward its next target, deeper into Dominion space, the galaxy was no longer laughing. They were watching, waiting, wondering what humanity would do next. The Varn had ignored the first warning. They had ignored the silence. Now, they were starting to understand what it meant to be hunted not by monsters, not by warmongers, but by a people who had been patient for far too long. And somewhere, in a darkened control room on Earth, more ships were preparing for launch. More names were being added to the mission lists. Because the hunt had only just begun, and humanity was not finished. The silence had grown louder than any alarm, and now it stretched across the stars like a shadow too wide to escape. One by one, the Varn Dominion's outer systems were going dark not from war or natural disaster, but from something far more unnerving, a ghostly presence that struck without sound, without warning, and left behind only confusion and fear. The humans had not launched a full-scale invasion, nor had they made any demands. They simply moved through the Varn territories like a whisper in the dark, and each time they passed, something vital was lost. Communication towers shut down, data cores wiped clean, weapon systems rendered useless. The most terrifying part for the Varn was not the damage itself, but the mystery of how it happened. No security footage, no bodies, no captured enemy, just the aftershock of precision sabotage. Commander Alia Stroud and her crew aboard Silent Light had become a legend within weeks, and their name was now spoken only in whispers, even among Varn leaders. High Command, once proud and overconfident, had grown desperate. Some believed Alia was not even real, a myth created by a rebel group to spread fear. Others knew better. The evidence was too sharp, too calculated to be fiction. Alia wasn't just real, she was steps ahead of them at every turn. Inside the strategy halls of Varn Prime, confusion turned into division. Commanders blamed each other for the failures, suspecting spies or traitors within. Generals clashed in meetings, accusing subordinates of leaking secrets to the humans. In truth, no one had leaked anything. Humanity hadn't needed spies, they had used the Dominion's arrogance against them. Every Varn broadcast, every victory speech, every show of power had been carefully recorded, studied, and dissected. For years, humanity had quietly mapped every weakness, every overreach. They had observed, not reacted. They had waited until the right moment, and now the fall of silence was upon the Varn. But Alia wasn't just cutting wires and disabling tech, she was aiming at the soul of the Empire. The next mission was deeper, more dangerous. Her target wasn't a station or a weapon. It was the Varn Memory Vault, a secure facility that stored centuries of records, political files, war reports, colonization logs, and historical documents. This was where the Varn kept the truth buried, hidden behind polished lies. If humanity could access and reveal those secrets to the galaxy, the Varn would lose more than power, they would lose their grip on history. The journey to the vault took Alia and her team through a nebulous storm, one of the few natural barriers the Varn believed no ship could cross without detection. But Silent Light had been upgraded with systems reverse-engineered from Varn tech, mixed with human innovation. It passed through undetected, disguised as a data transport. No alarms were triggered. No patrols followed. Alia entered the vault's orbit silently, and the infiltration began. Inside the vault, guards followed the same routine they had for years. Security systems were old, rarely updated. After all, no enemy had ever reached this far. They believed themselves untouchable. But the moment the temperature dropped slightly in the upper levels, and the lights began to flicker without cause, some guards grew uneasy. By the time one of them noticed the internal doors were locking behind them, it was too late. Alia's team had already reached the core. They moved like shadows, disabling cameras, bypassing biometric locks, and accessing the hidden servers deep within the vault. The records they found were not just dark, they were horrifying. Forced experiments on lesser species, secret wars covered up, peaceful colonies wiped out and blamed on pirates, ancient treaties broken without consequence. The Varn hadn't just ignored the warning from Earth, they had ignored the suffering of hundreds of worlds. And now, those truths were being copied, encrypted, and sent directly to human intelligence units hidden across the galaxy. Alia didn't say a word as she watched the data flow into her ship's system. She didn't need to speak. The files spoke for themselves. The mission was almost complete when a silent alarm finally triggered, alerting a Varn elite guard unit stationed nearby. But by the time they reached the vault, they found it abandoned. Not a single enemy in sight. Only the server room emptied, lights still flickering, and a line left on the screen: history cannot be erased. The leak reached every corner of Varn territory within hours. Independent news channels picked it up. Pirate networks started broadcasting the files. Smaller species, long oppressed by the Dominion, now had proof of their suffering. Protests began on Varn-controlled worlds, not from humans, but from their own citizens. Riots followed. Military forces were divided, some loyal to the old guard, others disturbed by what they had seen. Even within the Varn Senate, senators demanded answers from their leaders. But there were none. The truth had been buried too deep for too long, and now that it was exposed, the foundations of the Dominion began to crack. Alia and her crew returned to deep space, leaving behind a galaxy that no longer saw humans as a distant, irrelevant species. They were now seen as something else entirely: watchers, avengers, correctors of balance. But Alia knew this wasn't the end. The Varn still had power. They still had fleets and weapons. But what they no longer had was the illusion of control. The silence that had once served them had turned against them. Every time they tried to speak, their own lies rose up to choke their words. Their proud voice was fading, and fear had taken its place. As Silent Light drifted toward its next destination, Alia looked at the stars not as a soldier, but as someone carrying the weight of 1,000 silences. She understood that her mission was not about revenge. It was about remembering every cry that had been ignored, every plea that had gone unanswered, every warning that had been laughed at. Humanity had once been overlooked, seen as primitive and emotional. But now they had shown the galaxy what those emotions could become when shaped by patience and purpose. They had become the storm that moved without sound. And in the heart of that storm, Alia was not angry, she was focused. Because silence had fallen, and in that silence, justice had finally found its voice. In the aftermath of the Vault breach, the Varn Dominion found itself standing on cracking ground. Across their empire, rebellion whispered like wind through broken glass, too quiet to crush, too spread to stop. Every stolen truth that humanity had exposed became a spark in the minds of the oppressed, igniting anger that had been buried under years of fear. On colony worlds where the Varn flag once flew without challenge, voices rose for the first time in generations. Citizens demanded justice, answers, and in some places revenge. Protests turned into strikes, strikes into riots, and from the ashes of old resistance movements, new banners were lifted. These weren't human-led revolts, nor were they organized by Earth's hand. These were the echoes of injustice that the Dominion had long silenced, now rising in chorus, emboldened by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had finally fought back. The humans had become a symbol, not of war, but of possibility. Alia Stroud, aboard the Silent Light, watched these uprisings unfold through intercepted transmissions, her face calm but eyes sharp. She didn't celebrate the chaos because her mission had never been to lead rebellion. It had always been to reveal the truth and give others a choice, to live in fear or to fight for change. But the Varn were not finished. Humiliated and cornered, they began pushing back harder. Martial law was declared on 20 border systems. Surveillance drones doubled in every major city. Suspected sympathizers were taken away in the dark, their families told nothing. Propaganda flowed through Dominion channels, painting humans as terrorists and manipulators. They claimed Earth had used lies to poison innocent minds. But for every broadcast, there were twice as many counter-messages spread through secret networks, messages showing the Vault files, the images of erased colonies, the names of species long gone. Alia knew that if the Varn succeeded in silencing these new voices, everything she had risked would be for nothing. So she decided to return to where it had all started, not Earth, but Station Norrell, a forgotten mining hub deep in neutral space, once destroyed in a Varn accident and abandoned for decades. It had become a hiding place for refugees, smugglers, and those who no longer trusted any flag. Alia's mission was simple but dangerous. Plant a broadcast node inside Norrell and send an uncensored signal across the galactic network, a message not from Earth, but from the free people of the stars, one the Varn could not twist or trace. When Silent Light approached Norrell, its scanners picked up multiple life forms, no active weapons, but plenty of tension. The station was falling apart, barely holding its orbit, but life pulsed within it like blood through cracked veins. Alia and a small team docked quietly, walking through rusted corridors lit by flickering lights and whispers of suspicion. The station's leader, former Varn soldier named KN, agreed to meet her. He had deserted the Dominion years ago after witnessing a massacre on a peaceful moon, and now led a loose group of rebels and civilians with nothing left to lose. He didn't trust her at first. "You bring the war here?" he asked, eyes narrowed. Aya shook her head. "No," she replied. "The war's already here. I'm just making sure people see it." After a long silence, he nodded and led her to the central power grid. There, her team installed the relay coded to activate only if it detected a system-wide shutdown in Varn communication. It was a last resort device, a digital scream that would travel faster than any ship, reaching the edges of the galaxy in seconds. Cain watched them work, then said quietly, "You're gonna make them desperate." Alia looked at him and said, "They already are." But desperation made the Varn dangerous. Only hours after Alia's ship left Norrell, a Varn scout fleet picked up their trail. The Dominion had begun using artificial intelligence drones to track human activity, learning slowly, adapting in small but dangerous ways. Alia realized too late that Norrell's location was no longer a secret. The Varn weren't sending a warning, they were sending a message. The fleet attacked fast, targeting the station's engines and power grid. Norrell didn't have weapons strong enough to resist. Explosions rocked its outer ring. Fires spread through oxygen lines. People screamed through the comms for help, but the nearest free world was days away. The Silent Light had turned back the moment Alia saw the first signal of Varn ships, but she knew they couldn't fight a fleet. Instead, she had one goal: activate the relay before the station was destroyed. As she landed amidst chaos, her team split up, one to the relay, the other to evacuate civilians. She moved through collapsing corridors, choking on smoke, helping carry wounded toward escape pods. The lights died one by one, systems failed, and the air grew thin. Then a voice called through the smoke. It was KN, barely standing, holding the relay control in his hands. "It's damaged," he said, coughing. "It needs manual trigger." Alia took it from him and looked at the control panel, twisted, sparking, a mess of fried circuits. She knew what needed to be done. The relay core could only be powered through a direct link to the station's reactor, but that meant someone would have to stay behind. KN saw it in her eyes. "I'll do it," he said, stepping forward. She shook her head. "You have people here. They need a leader. They don't need a ghost." Without waiting, she ran toward the reactor shaft, hands shaking but steady, heart pounding with the weight of all the voices that had been silenced before her. She reached the core, opened the relay, and connected the final wire. In the moment before it triggered, she whispered a single phrase into the mic. "We are not afraid of your silence anymore." The signal launched. A pulse of raw data flooded the galaxy: video, images, voices from Normal and beyond, proof of the attack, proof of resistance, proof of life still fighting. The Varn could not stop it. Even as they destroyed the station, even as Normal crumbled into flames and drifted into silence, the echo had been sent. In far-off systems, people watched in awe and horror. They saw humans not as conquerors, but as protectors. They saw Normal not as a wreck, but as a symbol. And in every corner where the Varn still ruled, that signal became a spark. Alia escaped just in time, bruised and breathless. Her ship burned but alive. She watched Normal fall from orbit, knowing what they had lost, but also knowing what had been gained. Silence had failed. The galaxy had heard the truth. And now, the resistance wasn't just a whisper, it was a roar. The galaxy had changed, but the war was not over. Alia Stroud stood at the edge of deep space, watching the silent stars as her ship drifted between systems scarred by battle and betrayal. Since the fall of Normal, rebellions had spread like fire through dry grass, each one burning a new path across the Dominion's once proud empire. The Varn had tried to contain it, using fear, force, and silence, but it was no longer enough. Entire worlds had refused orders. Military bases had gone quiet. Governors had vanished. Even the loyal ones had begun to question the purpose of their loyalty. Alia had become a ghost story told in hushed voices, but not as something to fear. Instead, she was a name carried by rebels and freedom fighters, a reminder that truth could be sharper than any weapon. Yet, despite all the resistance, Alia knew the end would not come through violence alone. The Dominion still had power, still had fleets and control over parts of the network. To truly bring peace, something greater had to be done, something no one expected. She realized the final mission was not about destruction, but about memory. The Varn had built their empire on lies, rewriting history to suit their image. They erased cultures, silenced voices, buried evidence. Now, Alia planned to reverse it all, to unlock the Vault of Origins, the Dominion's most secret archive hidden on their homeworld, containing records from before the Dominion even existed. No outsider had ever reached it. No one alive had seen the files inside. But within that archive was the true story of the Varn, where they came from, who they conquered, and how much they had hidden from their own people. The approach to the Varn homeworld was impossible for any normal ship, but Silent Light was not a normal ship anymore. After months of modifications using salvage tech from across the galaxy, Alia and her crew had transformed it into a stealth vessel that could phase between long-range scanners, absorbing signals instead of reflecting them. They called the upgrade the Veil, and it worked only once. They had one chance to reach the surface, break into the archive, and send its contents across every open channel left in the galaxy. As they neared the planet, Alia stood in silence, watching the black sphere that held the heart of the Empire. The skies were covered with defensive satellites, the cities below glowing like molten metal, vast and ancient. The archive lay beneath the Capitol Tower, protected by layers of encrypted defense fields and guarded by machines programmed to kill intruders without question. There was no room for mistakes. Alia didn't feel fear anymore, not because she was brave, but because she had lost too much to let fear slow her down. She carried with her the memory of every place the Varn had destroyed, every voice they had silenced, and every person who now fought because someone finally stood up. The infiltration was fast and brutal. They landed during a planetary eclipse, when half the defense grid went into sleep mode. Using stolen Varn credentials and forged signals, they moved through underground tunnels once used for maintenance during the early years of the Dominion. The walls were covered in forgotten writing, ancient, pre-Dominion symbols that even most Varn couldn't read anymore. It was a place lost in time, left to rot, while the Dominion built its towering lies above. As they reached the final security door, they triggered a silent alarm. Alia knew it, but didn't stop. She opened the vault using a plasma drill, melting through steel and alloy as red lights flashed across the hall. Inside, the archive wasn't digital. It was physical, ancient tablets, printed records, preserved voices stored in crystal memory. The truth wasn't just information, it was art, language, the evidence of entire civilizations absorbed or erased by Varn expansion. Her team began scanning it all, uploading it to their datapods. Outside, the enemy was coming fast. Security forces had surrounded the tunnel entrance, cutting off their escape. Alia had planned for this. She handed the pod to her second-in-command and said only, "You run. I'll stay." The officer tried to protest, but she stopped him with a look. "The story matters more than I do." As the team fled through the tunnels, Alia sealed the inner door behind them and activated a timed overload on the core terminal. It wouldn't destroy the archive, but it would blind the local network just long enough for her team to escape. She turned to the room filled with forgotten history, her eyes scanning one crystal shard glowing softly in the corner. She touched it, and a voice spoke, an old Varn scholar from centuries ago, talking about unity, peace, and learning from others. It struck her deeply because it was clear the Varn hadn't always been conquerors. They had once been seekers of knowledge, explorers, even allies. Somewhere along the way, they had lost that path. Alia realized then that mercy wasn't about sparing enemies. It was about remembering who you used to be before power turned to pride. The memory in her hand wasn't just history, it was a mirror. And in that moment, she forgave them, not for the pain, not for the cruelty, but for becoming something they were never meant to be. Outside, the walls shook as guards tried to break through. Alia took one last look at the archive and sent a final command to Silent Light: upload everything, then flee to deep space where the truth could live on. She didn't care if the Varn caught her. She had already won. The truth had left the vault. Across the galaxy, the transmission burst into every system like a supernova of memory. People saw the true face of the Dominion, not the one on flags, but the one in shadows. They saw the old Varn, the lost culture, and the betrayal of their own ideals. Some wept. Others rioted. But most simply watched in silence, understanding now what had really happened to their homes, their families, their past. On Varn Prime, senators resigned. On outer colonies, governors fled. And on 100 worlds, the people began writing their own histories again. Alia was captured, but not executed. Even the Varn commanders who arrested her didn't know what to say. She had broken their strongest vault without firing a single shot. She had fought not with missiles, but with memory. And when they asked her why, she simply said, because no one should be forgotten. Her name would be remembered not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of truth. The war faded not with a final battle, but with a final record. Peace, slow and fragile, began to grow not through surrender, but through understanding. And in the years that followed, long after the Silent Light became a legend whispered to children, the Varn rebuilt not their empire, but their identity. They opened the archives. They apologized. They listened. Not all forgave them, but some did. And that was enough. Mercy, after all, was not weakness. It was memory. And memory, when shared freely, could heal even the deepest wounds across the stars.